I'll just make this point before I sit down, Honorable Chairperson, our Chairperson. As we were walking around Sandton last week, engaging various media houses, what is true is that there were some of us, truly South Africans, who believe that indeed the alert comes from Washington, it must be true and authentic, because simply it comes from Washington.
Exactly.
And we had a bit of a discussion with our colleagues in Sandton around this matter. Why must it be believed because it comes from Washington, without even assuming that there's an agenda, because it must be assumed it comes from Sandton, it comes from Washington, therefore it has no agenda. I explained, one instant I explained for an example, I said, I hope that colleague is here. I gave one example. I said the whole world, a few years ago, for the first time we heard of something called weapons of mass destruction. We were told that there's volumes and volumes of evidence and intelligence. And ultimately, the leader of that country was killed. To date, no evidence has been given to anybody. Actually, there is no evidence that there were any weapons of mass destruction except resources.
Well, 2 weeks ago, South Africans were reminded of the fragility of their peace after the US released a terror alert, throwing the country into a frenzy. The South African government went on an offensive, slating the US embassy for failing to follow procedure. Good evening and welcome to Unfiltered. My name is Aldrin Simpier. So amidst reports of increasing threats of terrorism, tonight we discuss how prevalent terror-linked activities are in South Africa. Let's welcome our guest this evening, terror accused Ferhad Hoomer, who will be joining us in the next while, just trying to establish that link to him. He is one of the 4 individuals recently sanctioned by the US Treasury for facilitating finances for ISIS in Syria, as well as ISIS in Mozambique. Mr. Hoomer was previously accused of starting an ISIS cell in Durban and was also linked to the 2018 Shia mosque attacks, but the charges against him were then dropped. We also welcome expert in counterterrorism, Jasmine Opperman, as well as human rights lawyer Yusha Toyop, who's joining us this evening. We're asking you also this evening, how prevalent are terror-linked activities in the country? Feel free to go onto our social media pages. You can search for Unfiltered SABC on Facebook, or just go on to our Twitter link, go to @UnfilteredSABC to be part of the conversation. And thanks once again for joining us this evening. I want to start off the conversation firstly with Jasmine, just opening remarks from your end with that question that we're asking our guests this evening, as well as our listeners this evening. How prevalent are terrorism activities in the country?
Or in the now, the fact that we had people willing to move to the caliphate during the time the ISIS ruled the geographical area in Iraq and Syria has proven that there are people with definite sentiments towards an extremist ideology for whatever reason it may be. The fact is that we had people willing, and we still have women and children in Syria in our whole camp being held because of their association with the Islamic State. That's point number 1. Point number 2 on the issue of financing, a seriously complex debate. We have seen the Treasury now releasing a statement tonight linking specific members, targeting members from Durban to the Islamic State and their companies for financing, allegedly financing. But with our organized crime and the financial flows and the lack of control over these flows, the probability that such money can end up in terrorist hands cannot be denied. Is there a calculated intent to support international terror networks in Africa or in Europe? We have to be realistic that such opportunities are available to those willing to support such groups. In a broader context, the region's vulnerability to terrorism has intensified. We see the Islamic State in Cabo Delgado and how that is moving and entrenching its footprint. Hence, we cannot take these words or the course of terrorism just lightly or ignore them, but we need our own sovereign, realistic perspective on where we stand with these terror groups on home soil.
Yeah. And Toyab, thank you so much for joining us this evening as well. From your end and the work that you've done, have you seen any South Africans being convicted of terrorism?
Yeah, so I was struggling to hear Jasmine in what she said, but I mean, I think we need to approach it very, very differently, because she talks about extremism and people wanting to relocate to ISIL. Who declared ISIL a terrorist organization? The United States. The United States has been behind every terror act that we've witnessed. So it all depends on which narrative you're following. In direct answer to your question, the Poktetara legislation came into effect in 2005, enforced legislation by the US for South Africa to accept because it was projecting. If we look at any country in the world, the US has interfered, has caused havoc, has essentially brought these countries down to shame. They don't exist anymore. Libya, Syria, Yemen, Afghanistan, all of these countries don't exist because of the real terrorists. So when you say the US has declared them to be terrorists, if we look at the Poktetara legislation, every one of the South Africans who serve in government today and since '94 would be convicted and prosecuted and convicted in terms of this legislation for what they did. The UDF, AZAPO, all of them. This legislation is all catching. But it's enforced post-2001. Why? Because the US master says, this is the legislation you will adopt. This is the narrative that the world wants to believe. So you have me here tonight. There was nothing in the US alert that it was a Muslim threat. But suddenly we have intelligence talking about Wala and Bara. So the new, and we don't call it war on terror, we call it the war of terror, because what it is doing is it's demonizing only Muslims. If we look at the history of all of this, Guantanamo, only Muslims. Extrajudicial killings, only Muslims. Countries invaded. Talk about collateral damage, for God's sake, in this day and age. Muslims die, it's collateral damage. Yemen. A country now annihilated because the US deemed that it shouldn't exist anymore.
But we can't deny that terrorism does actually exist.
Well, whose terrorism? Whose terror? The right of self-determination? The right of Muammar Gaddafi to challenge the petrodollar? The right of Russia and China now to challenge the US? It's the same thing. It's absolutely the same thing.
Yeah, but how would you then characterize what's happening in Mozambique?
Well, but this is exactly the point. If the US wanted to eliminate ISIL in Mozambique, it could do so in 6 hours or less. But it suits them to keep them alive.
The point that I'm trying to get to is that terrorism does exist.
On whose?
So the conversation maybe perhaps is that unfairly so, the description or the face that has been given to terrorism is a Muslim face.
But that's the point.
Unfairly so.
Absolutely.
But how do we describe what's happening in Mozambique?
Well, what I'm saying to you is it's convenient to keep it alive in Mozambique. The US has gone into other countries and annihilated cities in hours. If they really want to curb, they want to keep the problem alive so that you and I have this fear, so that they can issue these directives at the LGBTQ function because they know the Muslim populace is going to, the Muslim community is going to react. That's the narrative they want you to play into. If they wanted to eliminate terrorism in Mozambique, they needed to spend their special forces for an hour or two and it would be eliminated. But it suits them to keep them there because the threat hangs. And it keeps people like Jasmine on alert that these are extremists. It's not the case. They can eliminate it immediately. They've eliminated ISIL in every other place that they found them. Every other place that they found them, they've annihilated them. Mozambique is easy for the US. It suits them to keep it alive because we now need to play that ISIS is on our doorstep.
I'll get Jasmine to respond to that. And just remember, what you can do is you can tweet using the handle @Unfiltered SABC. You can also go into our Facebook page and just search for Unfiltered SABC as we have this conversation on terrorism and also asking how how South Africa is linked to some of these terrorism activities. We've also heard, as Jasmine has pointed out as well, that some organizations within the country are being used to funnel and fund terrorism. And welcome back. Let's welcome into the conversation Ferhad Hoomer, who is previously accused of starting an ISIS cell in Durban and was also linked to the 2018 Shia mosque attack in Verulam, and those charges against him have since been dropped. Ferhad, good evening, and thank you so much for making time for us.
Good evening. Thank you for having me.
I don't know if did you see the statement that came from the US Treasury today?
No. Today?
Yeah.
No, I haven't.
Okay, so the US Treasury has issued yet another statement, and today they say that Treasury is targeting key individuals in the ISIS network in South Africa, as well as their business assets, and you are again listed there. So you don't know about this?
No, I'm actually overseas, so I haven't heard anything from anyone. This is news to me.
This is news to you. Okay. When did you first heard that you were on that list and you were sanctioned?
Beginning of this year, when the sanctions came out, we heard about it, where all my bank accounts was frozen. And I think it was in March this year.
Mm-hmm. It was in March this year. Was there any communication that was done with you or through your lawyers, perhaps?
Nothing. No information from America or from FBI or CIA, nothing at all. Just sanctions put on me. And our legal team is busy drawing up papers to submit in December, January, early next year.
Yeah. But what do you make of your inclusion on that list? What do you read into it?
I have no idea because, my business, I'm in the gold and diamond business. And every year I got to get a police clearance to say whether I have any criminal records. I have no criminal records. I'm 46 years old. I have no criminal records. Every year I get a police clearance certificate shows that I'm clean. So I don't know where all the sanctions and all this stuff is coming from.
Well, okay. I'm just going through the statement again. And one of the other companies, I don't know if these are any of your companies, Hashik Jewelers, CC, Sultan's Construction, do you know any of those companies?
That's my company as well.
That's your company as well. That is also on this list as well. Then it goes on to speak about the sanctions. Unfortunately, we don't have time to go into that. But just quickly, Jasmine, when somebody is put on a list like this and also sanctioned, what sort of communication should be taking place? Because we're also dealing here with human beings, after all.
I do agree with that. I think it is quite disturbing to hear that there has been no communication take place. Look, the implications of today's statement relates to business activity taking place on U.S. soil itself and business transactions. And at the end of the day, we are talking about individuals being linked to an international terror group, and that's a serious indictment to make. I mean, if we go back to Mayfair and the so-called house raid, if we go back to Verulam, if we go back to Woolworth incidents in KwaZulu-Natal, there is simply no evidence yet that these actions were inspired by the Islamic State itself or an international terror group. And the individuals being listed now seems to be based on intelligence that the U.S. have on certain individuals jumping to a conclusion on an ISIS cell that is highly organized and functioning. I have yet to see the evidence that this is actually at play in KwaZulu-Natal itself.
Yeah. Okay, and Toyab, just quickly, as you're listening into the conversation that I just had with Mr. Hoomer, and also taking into consideration other people who had been accused of terrorism, and Jasmine now speaks about the absence of evidence. What do you make of it?
Yeah, but this is exactly how the US operates. I mean, we've seen them rendition people. We've seen extrajudicial killings. We've seen them annihilate their own citizens in drone attacks because they speak out. They don't need evidence. They don't need evidence, and this is why I'm saying to you at the start of the conversation, it's the narrative you run with. Who is the terrorist? If ISIS is fighting against US oppression, who's the terrorist in the equation? And that's the narrative. So the narrative, by you bringing me here, without there being an Islamist and I use that word unwillingly, fundamentalist extremist, why are we even here? That red alert was issued as terrorist, but the new war of terror is against the Muslim. And it's only Muslims that are being annihilated. And so you need to understand the narrative before. They don't need evidence against Ferhad Hoomer.
Yeah.
They don't need evidence against Imam Anwar Awlaki, rahimullah. They don't need evidence. They can just eliminate as they please. Because they have the right to do that. Because they're the superpower. They want world dominance. And they're executing it in the way they know how. So and this is the problem. Rule of law doesn't mean a thing to them.
In your experience, especially with the representation of or representing the Tulsi twins, for instance, they were lured by something. Outside of the CIA, there was surely something that was appealing to them, right?
And that's exactly the point. And I think Jasmine, at the time of the plea deal, agreed with it. They were lured by a CIA agent in a social media group. They were lured in. They were financed. Or the world over. If you look at the number of detainees in the UK and the US, all lured into entrapped. We were going to plead entrapment in the Tulsi matter. They were brought in by an Abu Fida, someone who acted as the extremist, who gave them money. And in the UK and the US, we know, funded, transported, and even gave weapons. So this entrapment is a US strategy. And it was so clear in the Tulsi matter, so clear. And eventually the CIA agent refused to come to South Africa to testify. And that was the difficulty the state had. It could not prove certain aspects of the matter because the US was only willing to go so far in regard to the mutual legal assistance agreement. But the actual agent, in their answer was, could not be exposed because he's currently operational.
Yeah.
There we go.
But just quickly then, they were buying into something. There was something that was sold to them that they gave into. What was that?
Okay, so if we look at the context of immigration, immigration itself is not unlawful.
Yeah.
If you wish to go to another country, you're entitled to do so. They intended to go, and the facilitator happened to be a CIA agent who was going to give them funding to go. And that was it. That was it. The funding was coming from an outside source. Money was paid into a Capitec account, and that facilitated the means of travel.
Yeah. Let me quickly go back to Ferhad. Ferhad, on your end, some of the allegations that were leveled against you by the South African state this time, including the Verulam mosque attack, and I saw an article indicating that you're also now looking into suing the state. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, we're suing the state for about 157 million, I think it is. And that was for damages and for all the 19 accused. I mean, if you follow our case, you'll see that the state hasn't proven anything against us. I think when they started off, we had 21 charges, and then they went up to about 40 some more charges, and then they finished off 18 months later or 19 months later with no charge. And, you know, it's sad what the state is doing. I don't understand. I mean, the FBI as well. I mean, when they put the sanctions on me, we read the article. The article said that myself and, I don't know, a group of people in South Africa funded the Islamic State with 6 billion rands. I mean, 6 billion is a lot of money, and they can't prove, 1,000 rand for my accounts that went to the Islamic State. I mean, 6 billion is a lot of money, you know. So I don't know where they're getting the information from and how they're getting away with this murder, because they just go around and destroy people's lives like this.
So, for instance, if we look at the first sanction statement from the U.S. Treasury, they make reference to your arrest as per what happened here in South Africa. Of course, the charges have since been dropped. The matter hasn't continued. Do you think that that feeds into that narrative?
You know, there was not one charge from all the charges put on me that I was accused of, or the state won against me. You understand? Not one charge. So that case has been dropped and we're suing the state there. So I don't know why we're talking about that case.
Yeah, because that's the case that they're making reference to. This is now speaking about the US Treasury. They're making reference to that particular case and speaking about your arrest.
Correct. I was arrested, I was charged, but all charges have been dropped.
Yeah.
So am I guilty or am I innocent?
No. So what I'm trying to point to is that, do you believe that that particular arrest then feeds into this narrative that has been created by the US Treasury? Because the statement says arrest. Yes, it doesn't speak about conviction, but we know even the use of words such as arrest, what that translates.
Yeah, but there should be some justice. I mean, if I was arrested and not proven guilty, am I not innocent?
Yeah. No, point taken. We continue the conversation just after this. Yep, we continue the conversation just after this. You'll take some of your tweets as well. You can tweet at Aldrin St. Pierre, also tweet at Unfiltered SABC, and you can post on Facebook as well. Just search for Unfiltered SABC. And we're concluding our conversation this evening looking at terrorism-linked activities here in South Africa. Ferhad Hoomer also joining us for this conversation. Ferhad, let's start off with you, probably getting some closing remarks from your end, but also asking you, why do you think your name keeps on popping up?
I like to know that myself, honestly speaking. I'd just like to put some light on the Tulsi twins. The Tulsi twins case was such a, I've been following up with the case, after my arrest. And it was such honestly, a case that was, the boys spent 6 years in prison, and the 6 main years of their life, their youth. And when I was taking the case out, these boys had paintball guns with them. And the paintball guns, they had no other weapons, real weapons, and they were funded by the FBI or the CIA, funded and motivated and told what to do, and they pulled time. I wonder how or what the South African government's going to do about the FBI and the CIA, putting people in traps like the CIA and making their lives, destroying their lives. This was so injustice and unfair on these boys.
Yeah, Mr. Tayop, with what he just said, some closing remarks from your end as well, and also the role of the South African government. Yeah,
look, so in essence, I sympathize with Ferhad's position, because if you look at Guantanamo, not a single prosecution. Everyone who was arrested, painted in the same light, not a single conviction, and people who can't return home. Insofar as our government is concerned, it's got blood on its hands. Saud Memon was extradited from this country. Khalid Rashid was extradited from this country. The South African government's got a lot to answer for. So the big bully is calling the shots, and South Africa is pandering to it. One would have hoped, with our history of discrimination, that this would never have happened. And Jasmine, just quickly in closing, your closing remarks as well, taking into consideration that once you have all of these false alarms, how it almost turns a joke into these terrorism activities.
In terms of the comments made by the 2 previous speakers, it all boils down to one thing. When it comes to extremism, when it comes to terrorism, we need an intelligence service that's on the ball, that can counter any accusations, that can protect any individual that is linked to an international terror group. When we lack such a capacity, we're going to be left exposed to foreign international agendas, and we cannot allow that. The Tulsi case has shown that. I cannot understand that the Tulsi case went on, whereas entrapment is illegal according to our constitution. So what I'm trying to say, let's not be naive around the threat of extremism, but let us not fall trapped into what.
Unfortunately, we've run out of the time. Jasmine, thank you so much for your time. Mr. Tayop, I appreciate your time as well. And Mr. Hoomer, really appreciate your time. And thank you so much for choosing us this evening. Unfiltered on S3. See you again next week, Monday, same time, same place, right here on S3. Totsins. Enjoy the rest of your evening.